Yeah, I was just gonna say that like interviews in general are so performative, right? Like on both sides. I think employers perform a lot during the interview process as well. They say they have a great culture and a great this and a great that, and sometimes they're also pumping it up a little bit, right? So I think data, like more data and more like verified data of like examples from the past on both sides is actually really necessary. And Derek alluded to it, but it's our kind of like long-term goal is like bringing more data into the hiring process on both sides so that employers and applicants can make really informed decisions on if it's going to be like an actual fit for them.
Welcome to the Attraction Pros podcast, where we discuss the latest trends and challenges facing the attractions industry today.
We chat with some of the top leaders in the field and provide resources that will help develop your career in this great industry.
I am Josh Liebman. I am obsessed with the guest experience and helping attractions make that their top priority for success.
And I'm Matt Heller. I am passionate about organizational effectiveness, leadership development, and employee engagement.
Now sit upright, hold on tight, and get ready for the Attraction Pros podcast.
Hey, Josh, how are you?
Hey, Matt, I'm doing great. How are you?
I am fantastic.
You read my socks.
Which I hope to see soon when you're at the airport, but he's got him on right now.
I don't know if I can.
I saw him, though. I saw him.
Knock over everything. If you're not watching on YouTube, you're missing out.
That's right. That's right. Check out the video. But I do have a question for you as you center your Cedar Point poster.
Back together here. Yeah.
Have you ever applied for a job?
No.
Okay. And we're moving on.
Yes, I have applied for a job. Do you want me to expand on that, or do you have follow-up questions?
How was the process?
It depends. When I was 16, I worked in my local ice cream store. Actually, it was mostly Froyo, but one of their locations did have hand-dipped scooped ice cream. And I went in and talked to the owner. And that was the last time I had an easy time applying for a job.
Well, the reason I bring this up is because this episode is all about advocating for the applicant, making sure that the process works for both the applicant and the employer. Because today we get to talk to the co-founders of Evercruiting, Kathleen McDonough and Derek Williamson, who have all sorts of great advice and insight into the process of finding the right talent and getting them on board.
And Derek owned an ice cream store as well.
Yeah,
so
good time.
Side note on that. Getting into recruitment technology, I feel like it's one of the things. One of the things Derek said is that the process of hiring and recruitment hasn't really changed in the last 100 years. The biggest shift is that it's gone online, and I think that the technology behind it has ultimately become a burden for both the applicants and the recruiters as well. And they're aiming to solve that. And I love their mission and I love their passion behind it as well.
And one of the ways they're trying to solve that is really through drawing a line in the sand with AI, because as Derek and Kathleen discuss, AI might be being used for the wrong applications in terms of the applicant process. So if we can figure out what AI should be used for, tweak that process, and then still keep kind of the people involved, their thought is we can do a whole lot better when it comes to recruiting and hiring.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you've got that green banner on your LinkedIn profile, you will love this interview with how much they are advocating for the applicant, because applying for jobs can be so frustrating, almost to the point where it's too easy to apply to jobs these days. The recruiters are getting overwhelmed, and then it becomes very frustrating for the applicant. But their technology and their mission behind it advocates for the applicant. And I just, like I said, I just love hearing the message behind that.
So is it time to draw our own line in the sand and stop this intro so that we can get to the interview?
Let's do that, then we'll have it on our resume.
Hello, Derek and Kathleen. Welcome to the Attraction Pros podcast. How you both doing today?
Doing great. Doing great. Happy to be here.
Yeah, amazing. So happy to be here.
That is awesome. Can't wait to kick off this episode. And let's do that by hearing a little bit more about each of you before we kind of jump into what you do.
Yeah, so Kathleen, I worked in restaurants. Anyone from New England would know Bertucci's, amazing pizza with an olive in the middle of every slice. I worked there from high school, all throughout my 20s, and then didn't go too far, just went to the other side of working with restaurants in hiring technology. So worked at and helped build an applicant tracking system for restaurants specifically, and we worked with some really amazing brands like Tim Hortons, White Castle, Chick-fil-A, Dunkin'. And that's actually where I met Derek and some of our other Evercruiting founders. We all kind of clicked immediately because we had some core beliefs that like treating applicants and employees well was important and advocating for frontline managers was really important and building for them was important, but not just the people writing the checks. Helped build that company for about 8 years and then eventually we sold it. I took some time off and now we're building something new, Evercruiting. And I'm sorry I gave a little bit of a spoiler for Derek's background too, but go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, I mean, we come from similar backgrounds but different paths, I guess. So, going back to I coming out of school, like I went to business school and decided I wanted to do something non-traditional. I really had no desire to go into banking or consulting. And I got connected with this guy who had, at the time, two ice cream stores, eventually got up to seven. And I went to work with him as his like operations manager. So similar to Kathleen, started in food service restaurants. I did a good tour of duty there. I was in that business for, in total, probably about 9 years. But the guy that I was working for left the business a few years before I did, went down to Boston for school, and then out of school, he started what became Hire Me, which is the company that then Kathleen went to work for. And then after I sold my ice cream store, I reconnected with Rob. He connected me in, and we had the journey with Hire Me together. I eventually had taken over. I took more and more responsibility at that company, and then had taken over for Rob as the CEO. And then we did exit the company, and then Kathleen and I both stayed on for a couple years after the acquisition, but really kind of wanted to move on to new things. I think we both thought we were probably done with hiring technology or HR tech, but it just felt like there were still some problems that were not being solved, and so we pulled ourselves back in, and here we are.
So let's talk about those problems. Even before kind of the origin of the company of Evercruiting, what are the problems with hiring and recruiting that you both identified that said, okay, here's a gap, here's an opportunity here?
Yeah, I'll highlight maybe two big ones. One is this sort of ongoing battle that applicants, like people trying to find jobs, and employers are fighting, and it's kind of this vicious cycle, right? Like over time, we have made it easier and easier to apply for jobs, right? Whether it's on LinkedIn or Indeed or wherever. Everywhere's got these like one-click applies. And then recruiters go, "Oh crap, like I have hundreds of applications now for, these roles. How am I possibly going to go through all of these?" Then they turn to automation, like try and automate the process and have some auto screening and all these other things. And now you see some really interesting, questionable uses of AI to solve the same problem. But then that just makes the problem worse, because then job seekers hear that, well, you just have to apply for more jobs, because if you go to apply for a job on LinkedIn, you see that 400 people have applied for that job, right? And so it feels like a numbers game, and it's just this sort of never-ending cycle. But the biggest one that we found for service industries as well, on the employer side, is we realized that even in our last company, we were building software fundamentally for people who did not want to use our software. It's very different than, at a tech company where you have most of the employees are living in front of a computer. And so asking them to update the recruiting system when you've completed an interview or anything like that is a very reasonable ask. In a lot of service industries, right, these managers, the folks actually doing the hiring, expected to do something like the pre-screening and things like that, are on the floor or in the park or like they're doing so many things. And so that was just one of the biggest things that when we started Evercruiting, we kind of saw was like this problem still is not being solved well. And we kind of felt like AI actually finally had the potential to do that, which is where sort of the initial idea spark for Evercruiting came about.
Well, and Kathleen, I want to go back to something that you talked about because I think it dovetails into what Derek was just saying about those frontline managers that they're on the floor, they're in the park, like, and you said it so well. People We're designing something for people who don't want to use it, which is really interesting, right? But Kathleen, you mentioned sort of those core beliefs of supporting the front line and being, very open to, the struggles that other people are going through besides the people that are just paying the check to make this technology possible. So I'm curious, like, how does that now live in the world where you and Derek and the folks at Evercruiting are creating this process and using that as sort of your mindset to create something that people are going to want to use?
Yeah, I think before we were similar to other software companies where we would build for the people that are buying, and then we thought about a lot more than other companies thought about those frontline managers, right? And the applicants. But this time we're doing it totally different, where everything goes through the lens of the frontline manager and what they want, and that's who we're building for. And then after that, if we can get to it, the stuff for the HR manager, right? So I think everything goes through that lens of how is this frontline manager going to use it? Is it going to be helpful for them or is it not going to be helpful for them? And where is it going to meet them, right? Is it in a platform on a computer, or is it in their hands on their cell phone texting? And so we want almost all of it to be on their phone texting so that they can be walking around the park and doing any part of the hiring process.
That's really interesting and very specific to look at it through the lens of the frontline manager, the ones who not only do they need to use it, but you want them to want to use it as
Yeah.
well in the mix of, hey, they're also busy running the operation. And like you said, not just perhaps in an administrative role like HR might be, but if they're the ones doing the hiring. I definitely want to talk more about kind of the product specifically and dive even deeper into the problems that you solve. But I do want to hear about the kind of the origin of Evercruiting as well. And you talk about how you met at your previous employer, but then curious as far as kind of coming together and then really starting the company and what that was like.
Yeah, so we, like I mentioned, we worked together at a previous company, hiring technology in the space. So we remained friends, and it's like Derek said, we didn't think we'd get back into it, but in the 2 years or so that we were out of the space, something huge happened, AI, and we started kind of calling each other. Our calls to each other became like more frequent, right? Just to riff on like the problems that are happening, how AI is going to affect this in a positive way and in a negative way. And the calls with our friends in the industry got more frequent as well. And they kept mentioning a lot of the problems that Derek mentioned, which is like AI is making things worse. So we kind of looked at each other and like squinted and we were like, are we doing this again? Like, are we doing this again? Because we know we have an idea that can help solve that problem. And when the answer had to be yes, because we really wanted to help both our friends in the industry. But we decided when we said we were going to do it again that we wanted to do it a little differently, like I mentioned. But one of those things was dive into more industries like the attractions industry. We didn't want to just do restaurants this time around. We also wanted to draw a line in the sand with AI and make it very clear that we are doing it ethically, that there are certain AI practices that we won't go into, and I'm sure Derek can elaborate on. And then also wanted to advocate for candidates and employees as well as employers.
There's a whole podcast worth of stuff on, AI and that side of it. But, I mean, fundamentally speaking to the origin of the company, I think, Kathleen and I worked really well together. There's 5 of us in total. And it's just like, I'm sure you all have experienced it. Everyone has experienced like some people that they just like just things click, like you're just on the same page. And especially when you're starting a company, like there's some things that are just like just the foundational like moral, like what are our goals with a company? Like why are we even starting a company? Like and actually wanting to have a positive impact on something is not something that's always shared. So when you find people where it really clicks, you stick together. I feel like we could probably be solving any problem, but we felt like there was more to do with this one. So that's where we're at.
Well, there are a lot of problems in the world, so once you fix this one, you guys can move on to the next.
100%.
Um, but I am curious. Both of you have the restaurant background, and you mentioned that's kind of where your initial bread and butter was in terms of starting this, but also expanding into attractions. And I'm curious about that crossover into the attractions world because yes, we have guest experience, we have leadership, we have hospitality. But we also are a little bit different in how we operate in some ways. So I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts on that crossover into attractions or even other industries that could use your service?
Yeah, good thoughts, right? And I think, where Kathleen and I have the shared background in restaurants and we deeply understand that, I think we'd be naive to assume that there is an exact one-to-one map, obviously, to any other industry. And certainly in our last company, we did work with, a small percentage of our clients were not in the restaurant industry, but it was predominantly there. But, the biggest thing that I think, and it speaks to like why there are so many challenges with hiring in these spaces. But one of the most common elements is that you're often hiring for roles where the resume doesn't actually really tell you that much. And that's one of the common elements. Like when Kathleen and I have been talking to folks in other industries, that's one of the biggest things we kind of look for. And then the second piece is that we sort of call it like decentralized hiring, right? Like, is this fundamentally the kind of thing where everyone involved in the hiring process probably are sitting in front of a computer most of the day? And like, there's a whole group of other software tools that will solve those problems. Whereas, today, we look at and whether it's, in attractions, obviously, I mean, you have the immediate graft of like a lot of attraction, parks and things have food service components. But you also have just a lot of those roles that kind of fit that same bill of like it's even harder, like all of the problems that we mentioned with like you get so many applicants. And then even the resume, which is the one thing that's supposed to help you screen a little bit, like really doesn't help. And so fundamentally, like that's where we find there's usually a pretty good overlap. And even within any industry, it's not one size fits all. I mean, even with restaurants, there are some restaurants that we've encountered that are like truly central HR team. They do all of the hiring in one little pod, whatever. And it's like, okay, cool. Like, there are plenty of tools for you there. But again, that's I think where we see sort of an overlap and a lot of this like, same shared problems.
I would love to talk more about the resume not telling the full story because whether it's in the service industry or the attractions industry are really blending, a lot of people are in their first jobs. Therefore, their resume there's a lot of white space on it, essentially. Or if there really is anything at all, maybe I don't know, the club at school or the sports team or something like that. But what are kind of maybe the ways around that, or what are the ways that you're able to help solve for that in that maybe it is that 16-year-old applicant who is looking for their first job, and maybe it is at the pizza restaurant or the ice cream store or at the local theme park or attraction.
Yeah, really good question. And I think there are short-term things that help, and then there's sort of maybe a longer-term solution, which the letting the cat out of the bag a little bit, but like longer term, like our goal as a company is to move these industries away from like the current concept of a resume into something that's like a little bit more of a living kind of document that evolves as the person goes through and gets more work experience and things like that. But, short term, you're exactly right, Josh, right? Like, the resume often has almost nothing on it. And even if you had a really great AI screening tool, there's so many right now that will take the resume, match it to the job. Like, how are we going to do that when the the person's got like babysitting on the resume, right? And so that's where we look outside of the resume and look at things like video responses as an option, right? Especially if we're in guest facing, customer facing types of roles. Getting a little bit of a preview of how people speak is really important and how they can communicate and smile and hold themselves. And a few other sort of tools that we've found in terms of just pre-screening that are really effective that don't really apply to other industries, but simple things like how far do they live from the actual location or the park, right? Like, because these are not roles where people will drive 50 miles to get to work, right? Um, and then I do think there's a piece that, is partly technology and then partly, um, other, I think some like adapting in processes, but just I think the way we conduct interviews for a lot of these roles is probably a little outdated. The idea that we have to always do like one-to-one interviews and they have to be 30 minutes long, that kind of needs to evolve, largely because that's one, it's not enough time with any individual person, but then we have all kinds of other challenges right now in these industries where half of the people don't show up for the interview. And so when you're scheduling 30-minute blocks for all these folks, it just becomes really inefficient. So I think it's also just like revamping how you think about interviews. We've seen a lot more employers move towards, things like hiring events and that kind of thing, or meet and greet kind of things, right? Where it's like invite many people during one specific time block and sort of like pop in and out and ask questions and get to know folks. So.
Yeah, which is also great for the types of candidates that are for these roles, right? They might not, if you don't have a resume or you only have babysitting on your resume, you might not know how to interview in a formal setting, sitting down with the hiring manager for 30 minutes, right? But you have a great personality and that can shine in a more informal, casual group setting.
Well, and that's where I know a lot of folks in the attractions industry, they'll do group interviews. It's kind of similar what you guys were talking about in terms of meet and greets and, having an event and, really getting to know the person, again, beyond the resume. And one of the things that popped in my mind when Derek was talking was like, is the resume going to go away? Like eventually, is that going to evolve out of the whole process? Where I even know now there's people that have a website. Right. This is my resume. Like the piece of paper may just have a link on it, right? And it's but then they can update it more readily. They can put pictures in there. They can do all sorts of things. So I love the fact that you're talking about not just this recruiting tool, but really the evolution of recruiting and finding talent and, evaluating talent as well. One of the things that Josh and I talked about just earlier today was the fact that somebody can come in and they can practice and rehearse for that interview, right? And maybe they've had a mock interview and their parents were going through it with them and they sat down with their friends and they're so prepared for it and they do such a great job in that interview, but then that doesn't translate to the performance on the job, right? And we were kind of talking about some of those gaps of maybe training or, just not being prepared for when they are on the job. So I'm curious, number one, if you've seen that, and also, is there anything that, any advice that you have like for HR folks and operators that can kind of help with that gap?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's funny. I do think back to the ice cream store days, and maybe Kathleen had a similar experience, but I learned to be skeptical. I did a lot of hiring, when I had the stores, especially because it's ice cream stores in Canada, so very seasonal. So every year I'm hiring 30, 40 people, good amount of turnover. I learned to be very skeptical of my best interviewee because I almost always found exactly what you said. It was like they were great at interviewing, often either because they've rehearsed or because they've done a lot of interviews. What you're really getting at is that this whole hiring process, like fundamentally, has not really changed in like 100 years, right? The only thing we did was we put the existing process online, right? The resume itself is a super old concept, and we're still formatting it like the exact same way and everything. And then the idea of like, well, we have to do one-to-one interviews with an interviewer and in a setting that is nowhere near the work environment, right? And so I think we're seeing more creativity, and that's one of the things we're trying to be part of the conversation on is like what other ways can you get the best out of people who want to work for you? And whether it's like we're seeing like trial shifts or things like that, where like just get them in front of people, and see how they interact with guests, like and just like in an unsterilized interview environment. But I think it requires everyone to kind of like rethink like what are sort of the sacred cows in this industry or in these processes, and what do we need to change, right? So I think it's kind of an ongoing process, and we're still just, I think, starting to shape it. And I think really like where we're at in terms of especially like AI, like applying tools and everything, like we're seeing more and more application volume, and like I think we're hitting a breaking point at some point here, right? And that's, I think, really going to push some of these like rethinks.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that like interviews in general are so performative, right? Like on both sides. I think employers perform a lot during the interview process as well. They say they have a great culture and a great this and a great that, and sometimes they're also pumping it up a little bit, right? So I think data, like more data and more like verified data of like examples from the past on both sides is actually really necessary. And Derek alluded to it, but it's our kind of like long-term goal is like bringing more data into the hiring process on both sides so that employers and applicants can make really informed decisions on if it's going to be like an actual fit for them.
Yeah. You make a really good point that there is the risk of there being a dog and pony show on both sides to each other, and are either of them being authentic, let alone both of them. Hopefully that's not too normal or too common
Yeah.
practice, but it's absolutely a possibility because the recruiter is they need to hire, so they need to sell the idea of coming and working for us. Derek, you mentioned AI a couple of minutes ago. Kathleen, you said drawing a line in the sand with AI, and I want to dive deeper into that. I saw a tweet a couple of months ago that said candidates are using AI to apply for jobs, and recruiters are using AI to screen for them, and nobody's getting hired. And then it was like the Spider-Man meme where they're all like pointing at each other, or maybe pointing away. I don't know, whatever it was. But
Yeah.
what is the line in the sand with AI, and where are you focusing your efforts on?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start, and then I'm sure Kathleen and I talk about this all the time together. Um, we're in the early stages, I think, of AI being adopted into recruiting processes, and and there's a lot of new technology and like some existing systems that have added AI tools, where essentially they're doing, what I mentioned earlier, which is you take the resume, you match it against the job posting or the job requirements, and then the AI spits back a score, right? And I've seen all kinds of versions, right? It's a grade or whatever. And most of these tools are trying to skirt around their responsibility of not actually, like, spoiler alert is that like AI tools should not be used for that, right? The creators of LLMs like OpenAI and Anthropic, et cetera, are pretty clear like that this is not what these tools were built for. But a lot of the systems today are just trying to skirt that because they say, oh, well, we give the grade, but the recruiter has the final say, so they can always override it. But if I tell you a candidate is 1 out of 10, how is that affecting your judgment when you go to review their application, right? Most likely you're looking for reasons why that is true. And so like there are huge problems with that. And then there's all kinds of like other manifestations of that. We're seeing like AI to do interviews for you, and then it grades the candidates, and it gets even dicier because they do things like there are many tools out there that are grading candidates on like the tone of voice and like certain emotions and the way they express emotions. Like there's just so many problems. And so our line on the sand is that we're not going to use AI to replace human judgment. And there's like lots of, if you just sort of reshape like the thinking from using AI as the evaluator to using AI to highlight positives in people, you can all of a sudden open up so many more options, right? So like one of the things we're actually working on right now, which is I think a really like concrete example of this is on one hand you have this idea of like AI screening, spit back a grade, and the AI will very convincingly tell you why this candidate is a 9 out of 10 and this candidate is a 6 out of 10 when realistically it's who knows. If we change that a little bit and we say, well, why don't we just take a candidate's resume and highlight the strengths in their application? And then before we show that to the employer, we actually show it to the candidate and say, here's what our system thinks are important to show the employer. And then the candidate has the option to edit that or change it or anything. So we're trying to help them sell themselves. And now we've only sort of like expanded the pool. We're not trying to find any weaknesses in their application, right? We're only highlighting the strengths. And then we use the recruiters do what they're good at, right? Which is finding out which strengths are most important in the role I'm actually hiring for. So that's just like one, it sounds like a small tweak, but I think it fundamentally is very different. And longer term, I think we're already seeing a lot of those AI tools are going to be problems for HR people and companies because there is a lot of bias in those systems that we are just scratching the surface on. And it's going to be a really big liability as well. So those are my thoughts. I'm sure Kathleen has a couple more we can sprinkle into.
Yeah, and this is what's great about working with someone that has just your brains work the same way because our thoughts are pretty much the same. Just add that less AI being the evaluator and more of AI to do things for you, right? Do those small tasks of post my job for me, show me who I have to interview today, schedule my interview for me, reschedule my interview for me, do all those things. You don't have to physically do those anymore. You can text it, right?
So I think what's interesting too is you're really talking about when we talk about that line in the sand, it's using AI for what AI is best for, but then leaving the people judgment to the people, right? And I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had there, a great conversation to be had there. But I also want to change gears just a little bit from AI because one thing that I've heard both of you talk about is employee branding and how important that can be for, setting the right stage for getting the right people on board and managing your talent and that type of thing. So I'm wondering if you can go a little bit deeper into your thoughts on employee branding.
Yeah, I think employer branding is so incredibly important. I kind of like to think of it as so say someone's scrolling on Indeed and they see your job. In that 5 seconds that they see your job, they're thinking, they're not just reading it, they're thinking about every interaction they've ever had with both your company and anyone who's worked for your company before, right? So their friends and their family who might have interviewed with you. They're thinking about news articles they've read about you, about commercials or ads that they've seen, Instagram spots. Like they're thinking about everything. So everything they're thinking about you in that 5 seconds, I think of that as employer branding. And so it's really important to hiring, recruiting in general, because it is the decision, it is how they make that decision of, am I going to actually apply to this job or not? And then that, of course, affects both the quality and quantity of applicants you have, because if you have great employer branding and they have only positive things that they're thinking about, and they actually do decide to go through with that application, you are going to have more applicants and probably more quality applicants as well, or people that will seek you out to apply as opposed to just passively finding you on a job board or walking by a now hiring sign. And it's funny, I think we always think that it's the details that matter to employer branding, like where the job is posted, that's really important, or what's the list of benefits or the pay or the requirements. But I actually think a lot of the time it's more of like a feeling or a vibe, right? That is the deciding factor of someone actually going through the application and taking their time with it. And then also, one thing people don't talk about is just that it's not just the stuff on the outside. Like if you think of employer branding as like a house almost, like the siding, you could have a house look great from the outside, but when you get in, if that house is dirty and falling apart on the inside, like you're not going to live there, right? You're not going to buy that house. And I think of that inside as the actual hiring process, right? So your employer branding can look great. You can have great ads, commercials, and stuff like that. But if during the actual hiring process, it's not easy to do, you're not getting back to people, you're ghosting them, you're making it hard and you're rescheduling them a ton. There's so how fast you reach out to people if you're leaving them hanging and having like a really long hiring process. All those things I think are super important as well. And I think of it as like the inside of the house of employer branding.
Yeah. I'm gonna sprinkle in like I think a really good example of that is like the employers that do this really well have aligned everything like they look at their core values or like what differentiates them and then their entire branding and hiring process reflects that. And I think like a really good example of where like that's often misaligned is like core value is we deliver an A plus 11 out of 10 guest experience, right? But then you're not delivering that same kind of 11 out of 10 experience to people who have just applied for a job, right? Like candidates feel that misalignment even if you can't place it, right? You're like, I feel like, okay, all these core values are kind of just wallpaper.
Can't just talk the talk. You got to be doing it not just externally but internally as well. And that kind of reminds me of something Matt and I talk a lot about is about the intersection of the guest and the employee experience. And this conversation about employee branding or employer branding, it sounds a lot like marketing, and that recruitment is the marketing of the employee experience. And I'm curious as far as what your visions on that are as well, and if you either recommend or if you have seen instances where the organization's marketing department, which usually focuses on the consumer side, if they've been very involved with the recruitment side as well.
Yeah. Yes, we definitely have, and it's interesting, right? Because everyone's like territorial, right? And HR folks often don't want to have marketing kind of get involved. But, we have seen with some bigger organizations that sort of like overlap. We saw it, especially like in the restaurant space in our last company, after COVID, like after lockdowns and everything, and when restaurants started to open back up, we had like one of the worst labor markets ever. And so very quickly, the HR problem became the whole business's problem. And then there was this flight of resources into HR. But we did see some really good things come out of that. And exactly like you said, Josh, right? Like you have to treat recruiting as a business within the business. And you have core values that should be going into all of your HR processes as well. But you kind of need to think like a marketer. One of the obvious things to point out too is like your applicants are often your guests, right? So even if you deliver an A plus experience to guests, et cetera, outside of it, like if they have a terrible hiring experience, they may never come back to the park because now it just feels bad. You can not hire someone and still give them a really great experience, right? So yeah, we have seen a few companies really inject that well. It's very hard to do, I think, from an outside department coming in and like, all right, we're going to, here's our employer value proposition and like kind of top down it. Like to do it really well, I think you have to bottom up. You have to really deeply understand, like speak to employees, right? And like why did you actually come to work here? Like how would you describe the culture? What makes it really great? What are the benefits that were actually important? And then I think that's how you can kind of really, it's got to be a little more organic. So it's kind of a give and take, but then figure out what those things are and then add a little marketing sauce on top of that to really drive home those values, those messages. That's, I think, like the best tandem.
Yeah. So what I think is really interesting about that is, like Josh said, like the guests, if they come to the park or the restaurant and they may have seen the great Instagram, reel about it, but then when they get there and they have terrible food, like they're not coming back. Like, so to Kathleen's point, it's like that experience inside the house is so critical to your marketing, even without marketing, right? Because we all know they're going to tell two friends and they'll tell two friends and however many people will learn about it. But it's the same with employees. right? If somebody goes through a terrible experience in trying to get a job with someone, you can bet they're going to tell people about it. And that's going to turn off other people, which I think, again, word of mouth marketing works for guests as much as it works for employees. So I love the fact that we're coming together on that particular topic, and we are unfortunately getting down to the end of our conversation. I feel like it's flown by. Maybe it's because we have two guests and you're both just giving us so much great information. But I do also want to turn to the fact that you both run a podcast and you started a podcast and. I'm super excited because I got to be a guest on it and we had a great time, great conversation. But I'm curious, like when you think about starting a business, where does starting a podcast then come into play in terms of one of your initiatives and how's it going?
Yeah, great question. And you wonderful episode with you, and we'd love to have Josh on as well. So we'll get that soon. So honestly, the way it started, it started like how the company started, right? Organically from conversations we were having. We were having a lot of conversations with our friends in the restaurant industry and about these really important topics, right? AI in hiring AI in other parts of the business, just the whole people function, retention, turnover. We were having these great conversations, and it was almost like, oh, I wish we recorded that and let other people know because you just like there were so many nuggets of gold and like great advice in there. And so we thought if we could have conversations with our friends in the restaurant industry, record them and put them out there, and it could help just one person, that would be worth it, worth our time. And of course, in the process, we get to meet really great people. So that's why we set out to do it, and that's why it came about. One kind of feels like we're always drawing lines in the sand. Sorry. But one line in the sand we kind of wanted to draw also with this was like, we didn't want to just have, the CEOs of major corporations that are on the podcast circuit on. We really wanted to have the people that are inside the business doing things, right? So all levels of people from general manager to area manager, director of operations, chief people officers, but also all sorts of different types of organizations. So mom and pops, one locations, all the way to like Yum Brands, large organizations, people inside that working in talent development or employee experience, anything. So we really wanted it to be people in the business doing things that could help each other, help anyone listening.
That's awesome. Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. I can't wait to listen to Matt's interview and hear all the words of wisdom that I don't know, maybe I've heard some of over the last many, many years that we talk together all the time. But in the meantime, like Matt said, we are running low on time here. I agree. This time flew by. If people want to learn more about Evercruiting technology, if they want to find the Shifting People podcast, if they want to get a hold of either of you directly, where would you send them?
Yeah, so evercruiting.com is our main website. And so think of the word recruiting, take the RE off and put EVER on there. And you can find us that way. But also, Kathleen and I are both very active on LinkedIn. We love just, we have conversations all the time with folks about our software, and it starts, the best conversations just start with like an organic conversation. And so we love to just chat. We're very low pressure people. We're pretty strong believers that like the business will come as long as you're putting out the right vibes and you're just trying to be helpful. So we just encourage people to just reach out to us on LinkedIn, connect, and just we'll start a conversation and see where it goes.
Yeah, just nerd out about it with us. We obviously really like talking about this stuff. So
Yeah,
if you
sometimes
do
too much.
too, yeah, we like to talk about it. So yeah, both of us on LinkedIn, our names are very searchable.
Well, and to that point, our relationship started with a LinkedIn message because
Yeah.
I saw that you were interviewing a friend of mine and I said, "Oh, that podcast sounds cool. I want to learn more about it." I sent a message and you got back to me and now we're close friends. So,
Yeah.
great to have both of you here today. Wonderful information. I love the fact that you are running a technology company, but it's still very people focused, and that you draw that line in the sand to say, "Hey, we have to make sure that people are involved and you're really there to support everybody in the organization. So I really appreciate that. So Kathleen and Derek, thank you so much for your time. And for everybody out there who is watching and listening, just remember, we are all attraction pros.